Deep in the climate-controlled archives of museums across 3 continents, clay tablets rest in archival boxes, their surfaces covered in wedge-shaped impressions pressed into mud over 4,000 years ago. Among the thousands documenting grain harvests and temple accounts, certain texts tell a different story. They describe beings called the Anunnaki who came to Earth from somewhere else, who arrived not as tourists or conquerors, but as laborers, driven by need. And according to these ancient Sumerian accounts, what brought them was not curiosity or divine whim, but something far more mundane, the desperate search for gold. The texts are explicit about this. The Anunnaki came because they needed something Earth possessed. Welcome. I'm grateful you're here tonight, however late the hour finds you, ready to explore one of ancient history's most provocative questions. Thank you for choosing to spend this time examining what Sumerian cuneiform tablets actually say about why the Anunnaki came to Earth. This topic has generated intense debate for over a century, ever since scholars first translated texts describing divine arrivals and departures, celestial homes and earthly missions, gods who worked and complained about their labor until something changed. Here's what makes this subject so rich with competing interpretations. Mainstream scholarship reads these myths as sophisticated theological literature, stories that explained the origins of civilization, agriculture, and human society through narratives of divine action. The Anunnaki descended from heaven in the same metaphorical sense that kingship descended as organizing principles that transformed scattered settlements into complex civilizations. Their need for gold represented the actual historical importance of precious metals in establishing trade networks, creating social hierarchies, demonstrating power through accumulated wealth. But alternative researchers examining the same cuneiform texts ask different questions. Why such specific descriptions of divine arrivals if these were purely symbolic? Why do multiple independent texts describe gods coming from elsewhere, establishing operations on Earth, experiencing resource crises that required creating human workers? The ancient astronaut hypothesis, controversial within academia but compelling to many, suggests these tablets preserve distorted memory of actual visitors whose technology and purposes were mythologized by Bronze Age witnesses into religious narrative. We're not here tonight to resolve this debate. Scholars continue their work. New tablets are still being translated. Interpretations evolve as evidence accumulates. What we're here to do is explore what the texts actually say, to understand the Sumerian worldview that produced these stories, and to sit with the mystery of why ancient peoples would record such detailed accounts of divine migration if those accounts had no basis in experience or memory. What drove gods to leave their home and come to Earth? What did they seek here? And why do these stories, whether metaphor or memory, continue resonating across 4 millennia? Take a breath. Let yourself settle into wherever you are right now. Maybe you're in bed, the day finally released into darkness. Maybe you're in a quiet room somewhere, the world outside muted and distant. Wherever you find yourself, you're exactly where you need to be. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the weight you've been carrying begin its slow departure. We have time tonight, all the time we need, to travel back to the moment when gods were thought to walk among humans, when heaven and earth stood closer together, when the boundary between divine and mortal was understood as permeable, crossable, routinely traversed. If this exploration brings you some wonder, some peaceful curiosity, perhaps you'd consider leaving a like or subscribing. It helps others discover these stories, these questions that connect us across vast spans of human wondering. Thank you. Now then, close your eyes if you'd like. Picture the night sky above ancient Mesopotamia, the same stars that wheel overhead tonight. Imagine the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flowing through darkness, their waters carrying silt from distant mountains, building the land grain by grain, year after patient year. Somewhere along those rivers, 5,000 years ago, priests sat in temple archives, pressing reed styluses into damp clay, recording stories their teachers had taught them, stories those teachers had learned from earlier generations, an unbroken chain of transmission reaching back to times before writing existed, when knowledge lived only in memory and recitation. They wrote of the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, not as visitors, but as migrants, not exploring, but establishing presence, not observing humanity, but creating it, shaping the first people from clay and divine essence for specific purpose. To perform the labor the gods themselves could no longer bear, and the texts explain why this became necessary. What crisis drove divine beings to such extremes? What resource they sought with such desperation that they were willing to engineer an entirely new species to extract it? The tablets that preserve these accounts rest now in museums, fragile despite their survival, but the questions they raise remain as alive as the day they were written. What truth lies beneath mythology? What can we know? What must remain mystery? And why does this particular story, of beings who came from elsewhere seeking what Earth alone could provide, feel somehow familiar, somehow resonant, as though it addresses something we've always suspected but never quite articulated? Let's begin where the Sumerians began, not with gods, but with the world those gods would encounter. The land between two rivers, before cities rose, before writing captured memory, when the Fertile Crescent was emerging from the Ice Age's long retreat, a world waiting, patient and empty, for what would descend from the heavens and change everything. 12,000 years ago, the land that would become Mesopotamia looked nothing like the irrigated plain described in Sumerian texts. Where great cities would one day rise, where temples to the Anunnaki would dominate skylines with their stepped platforms of fired brick, there existed only arid steppes stretching to distant horizons, wild grasses bending under wind that carried no human voices, no prayers, no names for gods not yet imagined. The Ice Age was ending, though slowly by any measure humans would recognize. Glaciers covering northern latitudes retreated perhaps half a meter per year, sometimes less, their meltwater feeding rivers that carved different channels than they follow today. The Persian Gulf extended roughly 180 kilometers farther inland than its current shoreline, sea levels worldwide sitting approximately 120 meters lower than present measurements. The Tigris and Euphrates flowed separately to that ancient coast, not yet joined in the marshlands that later texts would describe as Enki's domain, the Abzu, where fresh water met salt in ecological richness beyond modern comprehension. Temperature patterns shifted across millennia rather than centuries. Pollen cores extracted from lake sediments and analyzed in laboratories reveal increasing precipitation between 12,000 and 6,000 BCE, the region transforming gradually from sparse grassland into more productive terrain capable of supporting denser populations. Wild einkorn, wheat, and barley grew in patches on hillsides to the north, in the Zagros Mountains and the uplands of what is now southeastern Turkey, their seeds designed by millions of years of evolution to scatter on wind and propagate without human intervention. No one farmed yet, not here. Hunter-gatherer bands moved through the landscape, following seasonal migrations of gazelle and aurochs, the wild cattle whose descendants would later pull plows through irrigated fields. They built temporary shelters from reeds and hides, maintained toolkits of flaked stone, understood animal behavior with precision that literate city dwellers would later lose. The night sky held the same constellations visible today, stars the Sumerians would eventually assign to their gods. Dilbat for Inanna, Mulbabar for Marduk, the steady wheel of heaven turning over a world that knew nothing yet of divine decrees or cosmic purpose. Archaeological sites from this period are rare and difficult to interpret. At Göbekli Tepe in southern Anatolia, dated to approximately 9,500 BCE, people who still hunted and gathered constructed massive circular stone structures, T-shaped pillars weighing up to 16 metric tons, arranged in rings and carved with images of animals, scorpions, serpents, vultures. This predates pottery by roughly 1,000 years, predates agriculture by similar margins. The effort required suggests organized labor, shared purpose, possibly the earliest stirrings of religious practice that would later blossom into the elaborate temple complexes of Mesopotamian cities. What they believed, what stories they told while carving those stones under stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of ice ages, remains lost. No writing would exist for another 5,000 years to capture their cosmology, their explanations for existence, their understanding of why humans struggled and suffered and eventually died. The climate continued its slow warming, rainfall patterns becoming more reliable in river valleys, while remaining unpredictable enough to make survival precarious. Wild cereals grew more abundantly in certain locations, their seeds larger and more numerous than in drier regions. At some point difficult to pinpoint precisely, people began noticing that dropped seeds sprouted, that certain plants yielded more food than others, that settling near reliable water and tending crops might provide steadier sustenance than following migrating herds across territories that belonged to no one and everyone simultaneously. This transition, called the Neolithic Revolution by archaeologists, unfolded over centuries rather than decades. It was not sudden revelation, but gradual accumulation of knowledge, trial and error, cultural transmission across generations. By 8000 BCE, settled agricultural villages existed in the northern reaches of the Fertile Crescent. Jericho in the Jordan Valley supported perhaps 2,000 people, surrounded by a stone wall roughly 3.6 meters high, sustained by cultivated crops and domesticated animals. Çatalhöyük in Anatolia grew even larger, its houses built adjoining one another without ground-level doors, accessed through roof openings, the dead buried beneath floors where families slept and cooked and conducted daily life. People were learning to shape their environment rather than simply adapting to it. They redirected water using simple channels, stored grain in sealed clay vessels, developed surplus that created new challenges. Who would manage distribution? Who would settle disputes over resources? Who would coordinate planting and harvest across communities, growing too large for everyone to know everyone else by name and kinship? The stage was being set, though no one could have known for what. The great rivers in the south, the Tigris and Euphrates, flowed through land that would prove both extraordinarily productive and dangerously unpredictable. Annual flooding deposited fresh silt, renewing soil fertility without requiring fertilizer or fallowing. But those floods came irregularly, sometimes violently enough to destroy settlements, sometimes barely rising at all and leaving fields parched. Managing water here would require engineering beyond anything village life demanded. Irrigation canals extending kilometers from river to field, earthen levees controlling floodwaters, organized labor, maintaining systems that benefited entire regions rather than individual families. Perhaps this is where gods first became necessary, not as distant creators, but as immediate presences who owned the land, who demanded service, who received offerings in exchange for protection and prosperity. The temples that would later dominate Mesopotamian cities served as economic centers, administrative hubs, the institutions that made civilization at scale possible. And the beings who inhabited those temples, the Anunnaki who texts claim descended from heaven, would be understood as utterly real, as present and powerful as the flood that could destroy a year's harvest or the drought that could bring starvation. But that development still lay centuries ahead. For now, around 6000 BCE, the southernmost reaches of the river valley remained largely unsettled. The land was flat, featureless, prone to flooding that made permanent occupation risky. The water table sat high enough that digging wells proved simple, but drainage poor enough that salt accumulated in improperly managed fields. This would later become chronic problem, soil salinization contributing to Sumerian civilization's eventual decline centuries after its peak. Yet this same challenging landscape, once mastered through irrigation technology and social organization, would support population densities unprecedented in human history. Imagine standing there in that proto-Mesopotamian landscape, 5,000 or 6,000 years before the Common Era. The sun rises over empty plains where Eridu will one day stand, where the first temple to Enki will mark the spot where kingship descended from heaven, where priests will maintain daily rituals for a god of wisdom and fresh water, where elaborate underground channels will connect temple to aquifer in ways that suggest purposes we still don't fully understand. There is only wild grass, occasional tamarisk trees, the river's shifting braided channels catching morning light. The air smells of dust and distant water, of earth unworked by human hands. Birds call from reed thickets. The silence feels complete. The world was waiting. Conditions were aligning, and soon, in geological terms, though still measured in human centuries, people would begin moving south into this challenging, promising land, bringing accumulated knowledge of agriculture and animal husbandry, metallurgy and pottery, the social innovations that separated settled farmers from nomadic hunters. They would learn to control the rivers, to build cities from mud and reed, to organize themselves in ways that required new forms of authority and explanation. The Anunnaki were coming, carried not from heaven yet, but in the myths and memories of people who would press the first words into clay, who would create writing to manage temple economies and accidentally preserve stories of gods who came seeking what only Earth could provide. The Sumerian king list begins with a declaration that has puzzled scholars for over a century. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not established by humans, not developed gradually through social evolution, but descended, given from above, arriving complete with the authority and organization required to govern cities that were themselves described as divine gifts rather than human achievements. This text, known from multiple clay tablet copies dating between 2000 and 1600 BCE, attempts to provide comprehensive history of rulership in Mesopotamia from mythical origins through historical dynasties whose reigns can be confirmed through other sources. The list names cities, kings, and reign lengths with apparent precision, but the earliest entries describe impossibilities: kings who ruled for 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years, reign lengths that dwarf recorded history, that exceed the entire span of human civilization as archaeology understands it. Alulim, first king of Eridu, supposedly ruled for 28,800 years. Alaljar, his successor, for 36,000 years. The list continues through 8 cities and multiple rulers before reaching the Great Flood, which it mentions as historical event dividing antediluvian kingship from what came after. Then it resumes with different cities, shorter reign lengths that gradually approach plausibility, hundreds of years instead of tens of thousands, eventually reaching historical kings whose reigns can be verified through archaeological evidence and whose reign lengths match normal human lifespans. Mainstream scholarship interprets these fantastical numbers as mythological, not intended as literal chronology, but as theological statement about the sacred nature of kingship. The impossibly long reigns establish that early rulers were closer to divine, that civilization's foundations were laid by beings who partook of both human and divine nature, that the institution of kingship itself was too important to have emerged from mere human innovation. But the text presents this information as factual record, not obvious myth. It uses the same format for mythical and historical kings, maintaining consistent structure throughout: city name, king name, reign length, total years of that city's dominance. The scribes who copied this list were sophisticated scholars who maintained temple archives, who calculated lunar cycles and predicted eclipses, who kept economic records tracking thousands of transactions. Would they have confused myth with history, or did they understand these impossibly long reigns as referring to something we no longer comprehend? Some researchers propose alternative interpretations. Perhaps the numbers use different units than we assume, measuring something other than solar years. Perhaps they represent accumulated reigns of entire dynasties, compressed into single names. Perhaps they preserve garbled memory of extremely ancient settlements predating Sumerian civilization by millennia, durations distorted through oral transmission before writing could fix them in permanent form. The text's geography adds another layer of mystery. It names Eridu as First City, the place where kingship initially descended. Archaeological excavations confirm Eridu as one of the oldest continuously occupied sites in southern Mesopotamia, with settlement layers extending back to approximately 5,400 BCE. The temple sequence there shows continuous rebuilding over millennia, each generation constructing new temple directly above the previous one's ruins, maintaining architectural continuity and sacred association with the site across enormous spans of time. Eridu was Enki's city. The god of wisdom, of fresh water, of craft and magic, was understood to dwell there in temple called the Abzu, the House of the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean that Sumerian cosmology placed beneath the earth. Later myths would describe Enki as humanity's benefactor, the god who warned the flood hero and preserved life, who gave humans the gifts of civilization against other gods' objections. If kingship descended from heaven, it descended to Enki's city first, suggesting this god's particular importance in establishing organized governance. The king list mentions the flood as dividing point. Then the flood swept over. After the deluge, kingship descended again, this time to Kish. The cities and kings that follow show gradually decreasing reign lengths, moving from the impossible toward the merely improbable, eventually reaching historical figures whose existence independent sources confirm. What does this chronological structure suggest? One interpretation holds that the Sumerians understood their civilization as having two distinct phases: an antediluvian period, when gods and god-kings ruled directly, followed by the flood that nearly destroyed everything. Then, a gradual rebuilding where human rulers governed under divine authority, but without the direct divine presence that characterized earlier times. The impossibly long reigns weren't meant as literal years, but as acknowledgement that the antediluvian world operated according to different rules. That time itself functioned differently when gods walked among humans. Cross-cultural flood myths complicate this picture. The biblical narrative in Genesis describes a world before the flood where people lived for centuries. Adam lived 930 years, Methuselah 969 years, Noah 950 years. These lifespans are impossible by biological understanding, but presented as factual in texts that later transitioned to normal human lifespans without acknowledging the shift. Egyptian King lists similarly describe divine rulers before human pharaohs, reigns measured in thousands of years before history proper begins. Coincidence? Cultural borrowing? Or do these independent traditions preserve distorted memory of something that actually occurred? Some period when conditions were different enough that normal assumptions about time and human lifespan didn't apply. We cannot know with certainty. The evidence is fragmentary, filtered through languages and worldviews separated from ours by unbridgeable cognitive distance. But the Sumerian king list remains, pressed into clay with apparent conviction that what it recorded was true. Kingship descended from heaven to Eridu, where it was held by rulers whose reigns exceeded anything we consider possible, until the flood swept over and everything changed. The tablets don't explain why kingship descended. They don't describe the mechanism of descent, or justify why this particular city received this particular gift. They simply state it as fact, as the foundational event that made civilization possible. And they do so in context of other texts that describe the Anunnaki descending for specific purposes, establishing operations on Earth, creating systems of governance and labor that would later be inherited by human rulers, when divine presence withdrew or transformed into something less direct. Standing in museums where these tablets rest, you can hold in gloved hands the actual clay that preserved this knowledge. The wedge-shaped marks are still crisp, still legible after 4,000 years. The scribes who pressed them believed they were recording truth, preserving essential information about civilization's origins that must not be forgotten. Whether that truth was literal history, theological explanation, or something between these categories, they considered it important enough to copy and recopy, to teach to generation after generation of scribal students, to maintain in temple libraries as foundational knowledge. The stars that witnessed Eridu's founding still wheel overhead tonight, and the questions the king list raises about how civilization began and who or what made it possible remain as open now as when the first scribe pressed those impossible rain lengths into soft clay and trusted that someone, someday, would understand what he meant. Writing did not begin with poetry or prayer. It began with numbers, with the mundane necessity of tracking temple property in cities grown too large for memory alone to suffice. The oldest readable texts in human history, from Uruk around 3400 BCE, are accounting records, pictographic symbols representing sheep, grain, beer, oil, land, quantities, and transactions that needed permanent documentation independent of any individual administrator's recall. The tablets from this earliest phase are small, palm-sized, their surfaces covered with simple pictographs that represented words rather than sounds. A circle with internal lines indicated grain, a jar shape meant oil, a triangle sitting on a rectangle represented a female slave, a head above a bowl meant to eat or food. The system was limited, capable of recording economic transactions, but inadequate for expressing complex thoughts, narrative, or abstract concepts. Why did writing emerge in Mesopotamia rather than elsewhere? The answer lies in the specific challenges Uruk faced around 3200 BCE. The city sprawled across approximately 250 hectares, supporting perhaps 40,000 people. Unprecedented population density that created logistical problems no village had encountered. The temple complex at the city's center, the Eanna precinct dedicated to Inanna, controlled vast resources. Agricultural estates worked by temple dependents, workshops producing textiles and pottery and metalwork, granaries storing surplus against poor harvests. Redistributing these resources fairly, or maintaining the appearance of fairness, required tracking who contributed what and who received what, when obligations came due and when they were fulfilled. Memory could not suffice at this scale. The system needed external storage, permanent records that could be consulted years later, that could survive the death of any individual administrator. The temple scribes invented tokens first, small clay shapes representing commodities, sealed inside clay envelopes. Then someone realized you could mark the envelope's surface with impressions of the shapes inside, creating permanent record without breaking the seal to verify contents. Then someone realized you didn't need the tokens at all if you marked the clay directly. And gradually, over perhaps a century, the marks became standardized, the pictographs became stylized, the wedge-shaped impressions made by pressing a cut-reed stylus into damp clay became cuneiform script, capable of representing not just objects and numbers, but sounds, syllables, eventually any thought that could be expressed in spoken language. For several centuries, writing remained primarily utilitarian. Temple receipts, work assignments, land surveys, legal contracts. The content was profoundly practical, entirely concerned with managing the material world. But once a technology exists, once humans possess the ability to capture thought in persistent form that outlasts individual memory, the range of what gets recorded inevitably expands beyond original purposes. By 2600 BCE, cuneiform tablets preserve something different. Names of gods, fragments of myths, hymns and prayers, the beginnings of literature that served purposes beyond economic administration. The Anunnaki appear in these early religious texts as a collective, not yet individualized with the detailed personalities and conflicts that later literature would provide. The word itself, Anunnaki, breaks down in Sumerian as offspring of Anu, the sky god, beings who descended from heaven to govern earthly affairs. Gradually, across the 3rd millennium BCE, specific gods developed distinct identities and mythological narratives. An Anu remains in heaven, distant patriarch whose authority shapes reality, but who rarely intervenes directly. Enlil governs the space between heaven and earth, controlling storms and wind, wielding the tablet of destinies that decrees fate for gods and humans. Enki dwells in the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean, serving as craftsman and benefactor to humanity. Inanna rules love and warfare, fertility and destruction, refusing limitations that other gods accept. These developments in religious literature parallel developments in city organization. As temples grew wealthier and more powerful, as they accumulated land and labor and precious metals, the gods they housed needed more elaborate theological frameworks to justify and explain that power. The myths were not purely symbolic, but served practical functions, establishing which god owned which territory, validating temple claims to resources, providing mechanisms for resolving disputes between cities through appeal to divine authority, mediated by priests. The emergence of myths describing the Anunnaki's arrival and purposes coincides with this period of temple elaboration and economic expansion. Texts from approximately 2400 to 2000 BCE preserve detailed narratives. The Anunnaki descending to Earth, establishing operations, experiencing labor crises, creating humans to perform work they themselves found unbearable. These stories were written by priests who administered the very temple estates the myths described gods as establishing. Who benefited from the system those myths legitimated? Does this mean the myths were pure invention, theological justifications created to serve contemporary power structures? Mainstream scholarship generally answers yes, interpreting Sumerian religious literature as sophisticated mythology, no different in kind from Greek or Norse pantheons, divine narratives that explained natural phenomena and social organization through stories of God action and interaction. But alternative interpretations note the text's specificity, the detailed descriptions of divine arrivals and activities that seem oddly concrete for purely symbolic narrative. Why describe gods coming from elsewhere if heaven was purely metaphorical? Why elaborate mining operations and labor crises if these were simply allegories for agricultural development? The myths could serve political functions while also preserving distorted memory of actual events. The two purposes not mutually exclusive. The gap between writing's emergence around 3400 BCE and the earliest preserved religious literature around 2600 BCE represents 8 centuries during which stories circulated orally, transmitted through recitation and ritual, modified by each generation before anyone thought to press them into clay for permanent preservation. How much changed during those 800 years of oral transmission? How much was lost? How much was added to serve evolving needs? Standing in modern archives where these tablets rest, you feel the weight of that partial record. Each box of cuneiform fragments represents potential revelations, texts that might illuminate currently obscure references, that might connect separate narratives into coherent wholes, that might transform understanding of what ancient Mesopotamians believed about their origins and purposes. But we possess only what survived. Texts that scribes considered worth copying, myths that served temple functions important enough to justify the labor of preservation, fragments of a vastly larger oral tradition that existed for millennia before writing and continued alongside written forms even after literacy became established. The Anunnaki emerge from this partial record as beings who came from heaven, who governed earth, who experienced needs and conflicts similar to humans but operating at scales and with capabilities that marked them as fundamentally different. Whether they were mythological constructs, cultural memories of actual visitors, or something between these categories, the Sumerians who wrote about them did so with apparent conviction that these stories mattered, that preserving them was essential, that future generations needed to know where civilization came from and who had made it possible. The clay tablets sleep in museum darkness now, patient as stone, holding questions that may never find certain answers. But they continue speaking across 4 millennia, asking anyone who encounters them to wonder, what truths might myths contain? What memories might theology preserve? what reality might underlie stories of gods who came from elsewhere seeking what only Earth could provide. Tablet number CBS 10673, cataloged in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's collection, preserves 134 lines of Sumerian text, describing events that supposedly occurred before human civilization existed. The clay measures approximately 18 centimeters by 12 centimeters, its surface covered in neat columns of wedge-shaped impressions. Baked hard by fires that destroyed ancient Nippur when enemies sacked the city around 2000 BCE, the tablet ironically survived because of that catastrophe. Sun-dried clay transformed into ceramic durable enough to endure 4 millennia. The text is known today as the Eridu Genesis, one of several Sumerian creation narratives that describe not just how the world was made, but why the gods came to Earth in the first place. Unlike the biblical Genesis, which begins with formless void and divine command, the Eridu Genesis starts with gods already present, already engaged in specific activities, building cities, establishing agricultural systems, organizing labor to maintain the cosmic infrastructure they were creating. The opening lines, partially damaged but reconstructed through comparison with duplicate texts, describe a time when cities had not yet been built, pure places had not yet been established. The gods, specifically named as the Anunnaki, set about creating these cities, each god assigned to specific location. Eridu for Enki, Nippur for Enlil, Uruk for An, the pattern establishing both divine ownership and territorial organization that would persist throughout Mesopotamian history. But the text presents this as arrival and establishment rather than eternal presence. The gods came, built cities, established operations. The language suggests migration, colonization, beings who possessed the knowledge and power to create civilization, but who came from elsewhere to do so. Whether elsewhere meant heaven in theological sense or some other physical location remains ambiguous in ways that frustrate attempts at definitive interpretation. Other tablets expand on this arrival narrative. Text excavated from library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, dating to the 7th century BCE but preserving much older Sumerian material, describes the Anunnaki dividing responsibilities, some assigned to heaven, some to earth, some to the underworld. This division suggests not omnipresent deities, but beings with specific assignments, roles that required physical presence in the locations they governed. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation epic composed around 1100 BCE, describes similar divine organization. After Marduk defeats Tiamat and creates the cosmos from her corpse, he assigns the Anunnaki to their stations, 300 to guard heaven, 300 to maintain earth. These numbers appear consistently across multiple texts. 600 Anunnaki total, half celestial and half terrestrial, an organizational structure that sounds more like workforce deployment than divine mystery. Archaeological evidence provides context for when these texts were written, but cannot verify what they describe. The Eridu Genesis exists in copies from around 1600 BCE, but the content refers to events supposedly occurring millennia earlier, before cities existed, before agriculture, before humanity itself. How would scribes in the 2nd millennium BCE know what occurred in the 6th or 7th millennium BCE, before writing existed to record it? The standard scholarly answer emphasizes oral tradition, stories passed down through generations, modified and elaborated, eventually written once literacy developed. The myths encoded cultural memory of civilization's actual emergence, agricultural revolution mythologized as divine gift, social organization reframed as God-established pattern. The Anunnaki's arrival represented not literal migration but metaphorical explanation for how scattered villages transformed into complex urban societies. But the texts themselves resist purely metaphorical reading. They provide specific details, names of cities established in particular sequence, divisions of labor among divine workers, complaints about working conditions that led to rebellion and necessitated creating humans as substitute workforce. Metaphor rarely requires such precision. Symbolic narrative benefits from ambiguity, from meanings that shift according to interpretation. These texts read more like historical accounts than poetic allegory, even when describing events that mainstream chronology considers impossible. The question archaeologists and historians confront is how to weight these accounts. Do they preserve any factual core beneath mythological elaboration? The Trojan War was considered pure myth until Heinrich Schliemann excavated Troy and demonstrated that Homer's poems referred to actual Bronze Age city destroyed by warfare. The biblical Exodus was dismissed as religious fiction until evidence emerged of West Semitic populations in Egypt during the relevant period, though the scale and details of the biblical account remain contested. Could the Anunnaki narratives similarly preserve historical kernel, events that occurred but became mythologized through centuries of retelling? Some researchers argue yes, pointing to the text's consistency across multiple sources, the specific geographic and chronological details they provide, the fact that ancient peoples generally based their myths on observed phenomena even when explaining those phenomena through divine action. Others maintain that searching for historical core in creation myths mistakes the text's purpose. These were theological documents, not historical chronicles. They explained the world's current state, justified existing social hierarchies, provided frameworks for ritual and worship. Their value lies in revealing how Mesopotamians understood reality, not in preserving factual accounts of Bronze Age events. The Eridu Genesis describes human creation following divine labor crisis, a narrative we will explore more fully in subsequent sections. But relevant here is the text's implication that gods did not originally intend to create humans. They came to Earth for purposes that initially did not require human assistance. Something changed, some difficulty arose that necessitated engineering intelligent beings capable of performing work the gods themselves could not or would not continue doing. What were those original purposes? Why did divine beings need to establish cities and organize labor? The texts hint at resource extraction, at maintaining systems, at working toward goals they never fully explain because presumably their original audiences already knew. We inherit fragments, references to activities whose full context was obvious to ancient listeners but obscure to us reading across 4,000 years of cultural distance. Tablet CBS 10673 rests in climate-controlled storage in Philadelphia, its wedge-shaped mark still crisp, still legible to scholars who have spent years learning to read Sumerian. Touch it with gloved hands in a museum conservation lab, and you feel slight ridges where the stylus pressed, valleys between impressions. The clay is cool, surprisingly light considering its antiquity, and somewhere in those patterns of wedges and valleys, ancient voices still speak of gods who came from elsewhere, who built cities in empty land, who established civilization according to plans we can only partially reconstruct from the fragments that survived. The tablets do not explain everything. They raise as many questions as they answer, but they preserve testimony that their creators considered true and important, worth pressing into clay and copying across generations, worth teaching to scribal students alongside mathematics and legal formulae. The Anunnaki arrived, established presence, organized operations on Earth. Whether this describes mythology, history, or something between remains open question that drives ongoing scholarship and alternative research in equal measure. We turn now to one specific claim these texts make, perhaps the most provocative, that the Anunnaki came seeking gold. Gold appears in Mesopotamian archaeological contexts from the earliest periods of settled civilization. Tombs at Ur's Royal Cemetery, dating to approximately 2600 BCE, contained elaborate golden objects, headdresses with leaves beaten thin as paper, daggers with hilts wrapped in gold wire, cups hammered from single pieces of metal, jewelry demonstrating sophisticated metalworking techniques including granulation and filigree that require precise temperature control and specialized tools. The gold did not originate in southern Mesopotamia. The alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates lacks significant mineral deposits, its geology consisting of sediments carried from distant mountains and deposited over millions of years. Gold had to be imported from Anatolia to the north, from the Zagros Mountains to the east, from Egypt to the southwest. Trade networks extending hundreds of kilometers to acquire metal that served no practical function but carried immense symbolic and economic value. Why did ancient peoples value gold so intensely? Its properties made it desirable, resistant to corrosion, remaining bright and untarnished over centuries when iron rusted and bronze corroded. Easy to work, soft enough to hammer into thin sheets or draw into fine wire without requiring extreme temperatures or complex alloys. Beautiful, its yellow luster catching light in ways that seemed to capture sunlight itself, making objects that shone as though holding divine radiance. But beyond practical properties, gold's scarcity created value. It was rare enough that accumulating it demonstrated power, wealth, access to resources, and trade networks that most people could not access. Temples adorned divine statues with gold, dressing gods in metal that seemed to embody divine nature, imperishable, radiant, precious beyond calculation. Kings wore gold to display authority, to show they possessed what others desired, to mark themselves as intermediaries between divine and mortal realms. Sumerian texts describe gods seeking gold with intensity that suggests more than symbolic importance. The Anunnaki, according to myths we will examine in detail, extracted gold from earth and sent it to heaven, working in conditions difficult enough that lesser gods eventually rebelled. This narrative appears in multiple independent sources, consistent in broad outline, though varying in specific details, suggesting it was central to how Mesopotamians understood the Anunnaki's presence on Earth. Alternative researchers examining these same texts propose that gold extraction was the Anunnaki's primary purpose for coming to Earth. Zecharia Sitchin, whose work in the 1970s popularized ancient astronaut interpretations despite scholarly criticism, argued that extraterrestrial visitors needed gold for technological purposes, protecting their planet's atmosphere, conducting electrical experiments, manufacturing advanced devices whose functions we can only speculate about. Mainstream scholarship dismisses this interpretation, noting that Sitchin's translations contained demonstrable errors, that his reading of Sumerian imposed meanings the language does not support, that attributing technological purposes to mythological gold-seeking requires ignoring how ancient literature functioned. Gold in myths represented divine power, immortality, the incorruptible nature of the gods themselves. Its pursuit in narratives served symbolic rather than practical purposes. Yet the question persists. Why such emphasis on gold extraction in creation myths if this was purely symbolic? The Atrahasis epic, which we will explore more fully, describes in detail the labor required for the Anunnaki's operations, the rebellion this labor provoked, the solution they devised by creating humans to assume that burden. The text is specific about activities: digging watercourses, extracting materials from earth, working under conditions the gods found unbearable. In 1976, British archaeologist Joan Oates published findings from excavations at Tel Brak in northern Syria, a site occupied from approximately 6000 BCE onward. Among artifacts recovered from 4th millennium levels, her team found evidence of early metallurgy: crucibles with traces of smelted copper, stone molds for casting tools, slag indicating temperatures exceeding 1,100 degrees Celsius achieved in simple furnaces. The discovery demonstrated that sophisticated metalworking existed in Mesopotamia's periphery earlier than previously documented. People were extracting metals from ores, experimenting with alloys, developing techniques that would later produce the bronze weapons and gold ornaments found in royal tombs. This was empirical chemistry, trial and error across generations, accumulated knowledge passed from master craftsmen to apprentices. But Oates also noted something curious. The earliest metal objects showed remarkable sophistication, appearing suddenly in archaeological record without clear developmental sequence. The techniques required to smelt copper from ore, to achieve temperatures high enough for goldworking, to create alloys with specific properties. These were not simple discoveries, but required understanding of materials and processes that seemed to emerge fully formed rather than developing gradually. This pattern, sudden appearance of sophisticated technology without evident precursors, troubles archaeologists who expect innovations to show developmental stages. Some argue that earlier evidence has simply not been found, that excavations have not yet uncovered the sites where metallurgy was first developed. Others suggest knowledge was transmitted from elsewhere, though identifying the source remains speculative. The Sumerian word for gold, kusig, literally means metal of the mountain, suggesting they understood it came from ore extracted and processed rather than found in pure form. References in administrative texts describe gold tribute from subject territories, gold traded from distant regions, gold stored in temple treasuries and distributed for specific purposes, including adorning divine statues and manufacturing ritual objects. Imagine standing beside the Euphrates in the 4th millennium BCE, watching boats arrive from upstream carrying cargo sealed in clay jars and leather sacks. Among the goods, chunks of raw gold, rough nuggets panned from mountain streams or extracted from quartz veins, destined for temple workshops where craftsmen will transform them into objects of breathtaking beauty and precision. The metal catches sunlight as it is unloaded, yellow gleaming against brown river water, tangible wealth that has traveled hundreds of kilometers because southern cities demand it, because temples need it, because gods require it. The texts say the Anunnaki sought gold. Archaeology confirms ancient Mesopotamians acquired gold through extensive effort and trade. Whether these facts connect in ways alternative researchers suggest, whether gold extraction was original purpose for divine presence on Earth, whether the myths preserve distorted memory of actual mining operations, these questions remain open despite scholarly consensus leaning toward symbolic interpretation. What we know with certainty is this: gold mattered enormously to the people who wrote these texts, and their myths consistently associated the Anunnaki with extracting and working this metal. Whether that association was metaphorical, historical, or something between, the Sumerians themselves seemed to believe that gold was not merely valuable, but essential to understanding why the gods had come and what they were doing on Earth. We turn now to where much of this activity supposedly occurred, the mysterious realm called the Abzu, the subterranean domain where Enki dwelled and where, according to some interpretations, the Anunnaki conducted their most important operations. The Abzu occupied central place in Sumerian cosmology, the freshwater ocean that lay beneath the earth, source of springs and rivers, domain of Enki, the craftsman god. This was not metaphorical water, but understood as physical realm, accessible through deep shafts and natural caverns. A subterranean geography as real to the Sumerians as the rivers flowing above ground. Enki's temple at Eridu was called the Abzu, the House of the Abzu, built over the spot where access to this underground realm was supposedly easiest. Archaeological excavations there between 1946 and 1949, led by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar and British archaeologist Seton Lloyd, revealed extraordinary architectural continuity. Temple levels extended down through nearly 5 meters of accumulated deposits, each structure built directly above its predecessor, maintaining the same orientation and general plan from approximately 5,400 BCE through the site's abandonment around 600 BCE. The earliest temples were simple, single-room structures barely 3 by 4 meters in dimension, with altars positioned at the western end. But even these primitive buildings displayed intentional design, doorways facing east toward sunrise, foundations dug deeper than structural necessity required, as though connecting to something beneath. As temples grew larger and more architecturally complex over millennia, this pattern intensified. Later structures incorporated elaborate underground chambers and channels, systems whose purposes archaeologists still debate. Below the temple platform, excavators discovered networks of brick-lined tunnels extending meters into the ground, connecting to deep wells that tapped the water table. Some channels were corbel vaulted, precisely angled to maintain water flow without requiring pumps or external energy. Others led to chambers too small for practical use, spaces that showed no evidence of storage or habitation, but seemed designed for some purpose that left no archaeological trace. What were these underground systems for? The practical explanation suggests they managed the site's water supply, providing fresh water for ritual purification, for offerings, for the daily needs of priests maintaining the temple. The channels could have drained away blood and fluids from animal sacrifices, keeping ritual spaces clean. The deep wells ensured reliable water access, even during droughts that might dry surface sources. But the system's complexity exceeds what these functions required. Some tunnels loop back on themselves. Some connect chambers that show no signs of use. The effort invested in constructing and maintaining these underground networks suggests they served purposes beyond utilitarian necessity, purposes important enough to justify generations of labor and architectural elaboration. Sumerian texts describe the Abzu in ways that suggest both physical location and cosmic principle. It was where Enki dwelled, where he kept the Mi, those divine powers or cosmic principles that governed civilization's functions. It was source of sweet water that made life possible, the underground reservoir from which springs emerged and rivers were fed. But it was also a place where secret knowledge was kept, where Enki performed mysterious operations, where humans were not meant to venture without proper authorization and ritual preparation. In 1962, archaeologist Thorkild Jacobsen published analysis of Sumerian religious architecture, noting that temple designs seemed to facilitate vertical movement between realms, ascending staircases to summit shrines representing connection to heaven, descending shafts to underground chambers representing connection to the Abzu. This vertical axis, Earth as middle realm between heaven above and Abzu below, structured both physical architecture and theological understanding. The Abzu appears in creation myths as pre-existing element, present before gods organized the cosmos. The Enuma Elish describes Apsu, the Akkadian term for Abzu, as primordial freshwater ocean, male principle that mingled with Tiamat, the saltwater ocean, to produce the first gods. This cosmology reflects observable hydrology, fresh water from rain and snowmelt in distant mountains flowing through rivers to mix with seawater in the Persian Gulf. But it also suggests the Abzu was not created by gods but discovered or accessed by them, a resource they utilized but did not originate. Some alternative interpretations propose the Abzu references underground mining operations, caverns, and tunnels where the Anunnaki extracted gold and other minerals from Earth's interior. The elaborate channel systems beneath Eridu's temples would then represent scaled-down versions or access points to much larger subterranean networks. This reading emphasizes texts describing gods working in the deep, language that could refer to deep water or deep earth, ambiguous in ways that allow multiple interpretations. Mainstream scholarship treats such speculation with skepticism, noting that no archaeological evidence supports extensive underground mining in ancient Mesopotamia. The region's geology, sedimentary deposits without significant mineral veins, makes large-scale mining implausible. The Abzu was theological concept, not engineering project, a way of explaining the water cycle and acknowledging the mysterious sources of life-giving rivers. Yet, the architectural evidence remains puzzling. Why dig elaborate tunnels and chambers beneath temples if purely symbolic? Why maintain these systems across millennia if they served no practical function? The gap between what archaeology finds and what texts describe creates space for competing theories, none fully satisfying, all attempting to reconcile fragmentary evidence into coherent explanations. Standing in museum archives where artifacts from Eridu rest, you can examine objects recovered from those underground chambers, ceramic vessels sealed with bitumen, tools whose purposes remain uncertain, clay tablets recording offerings and rituals associated with the Abzu. The objects are tangible, their archaeological contexts documented with modern precision. But their meanings resist easy interpretation, suggesting activities and beliefs we can observe but not fully reconstruct. The Abzu was where Enki performed the work that made him essential to the Anunnaki's operations on Earth. It was where he kept knowledge, where he crafted solutions to problems other gods could not solve, where he conducted activities the texts hint at but never fully explain. And it was beneath temples, accessible through shafts and channels that priests maintained with care that suggests more than symbolic importance. What occurred in those underground spaces? What did the Sumerians believe happened there? The texts speak of waters of wisdom, of mysterious me kept in Enki's possession, of operations that required descending into Earth's depths. Whether these descriptions refer to actual subterranean activities, to theological understanding of knowledge and power, or to something we can no longer fully grasp, the Abzu remained central to how Mesopotamians understood the Anunnaki's presence and purposes. We move now to the crisis that changed everything, the moment when divine operations became unsustainable and required engineering an entirely new solution: humanity itself. The Atrahasis epic preserves the most detailed account of what drove the Anunnaki to create humanity, a narrative so specific in its descriptions of divine working conditions and labor disputes that it reads more like historical chronicle than theological myth. The text, known from multiple copies dating between 1700 and 2100 BCE, but preserving older Sumerian material, begins not with creation, but with crisis. Divine workers overwhelmed by tasks they could no longer sustain. 40 years they labored, according to the text. 40 years digging the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, excavating irrigation canals branching from main channels, dredging silt that accumulated and threatened to clog the waterways, maintaining the infrastructure that made agriculture possible in the flat Mesopotamian plain. The number 40 appears repeatedly in ancient Near Eastern texts, sometimes literally, sometimes as conventional expression meaning a long time. Whether the Igigi, the lesser gods assigned to this labor, worked for exactly 40 years, or simply for duration that felt unbearable, the text emphasizes that the burden eventually exceeded their capacity to endure. The work was measured not in days, but in cosmic time, labor that from human perspective would span generations, but from divine viewpoint remained present tense ongoing struggle. They dug during day and night, the text says, their tools growing heavy in their hands, their backs aching despite divine nature, the repetitive strain of maintaining creation's infrastructure wearing them down year after year with no relief promised, no end visible. One night, the rebellion began. The text describes it simply. They burned their tools, set fire to their spades and baskets. They marched to Enlil's temple at Nippur, surrounded it while the god slept, and demanded he hear their grievance. The scene carries tension despite its mythological distance. Workers confronting management, subordinates challenging authority, the foundations of hierarchical order cracking under pressure that could no longer be contained. Enlil, awakened by his gatekeeper and informed of the uprising, reacted with fury. He summoned the other great gods to emergency assembly, Anu descending from heaven and Enki rising from the Abzu to join him in council. The question before them was fundamental: what to do with rebellious workers whose complaints were legitimate but whose actions threatened cosmic order. Enlil proposed simple solution: destroy the rebels, restore proper hierarchy through force, demonstrate that challenging divine authority brought only annihilation. But Enki, hearing the Igigi's testimony, acknowledged the validity of their complaint. The work was indeed too heavy, the burden unsustainable even for divine beings created specifically for that purpose. Destroying the rebels would not solve the underlying problem, would not provide workforce capable of maintaining the systems that kept creation functioning. A different solution was needed, one that addressed the labor shortage without requiring continued divine suffering. Enki's proposal was pragmatic and revolutionary: create substitute workers, beings capable of performing the necessary tasks but lacking divine status that would make enslaving them problematic. Take clay, the fundamental substance of Earth, mix it with something divine to grant intelligence and capability sufficient for complex work. Fashion creatures who would assume the burden while freeing the gods to attend to governance and cosmic maintenance that befitted their nature. The assembly deliberated. Creating intelligent beings capable of labor meant creating beings capable of thought, of suffering, of potentially developing their own grievances and staging their own rebellions. But the alternative, either forcing divine workers to continue unbearable labor or abandoning the infrastructure that made organized existence possible, seemed worse. They voted to proceed with Enki's solution, accepting the risks in exchange for relief from immediate crisis. The question became which god would provide the divine component, whose essence mixed with clay would give these new creatures the rationality required for their function. We-Ila was chosen, a god described as having understanding, or rationality, though the text does not explain why he specifically was selected. Perhaps he volunteered, accepting sacrifice for the greater good. Perhaps he was designated by higher authority, his consent irrelevant to decision made in assembly where rank determined whose opinions mattered. His sacrifice was necessary, the gods agreed. One divine death to prevent civil war among the Anunnaki, to address legitimate grievance while maintaining hierarchical structure, to solve a labor crisis that threatened the entire cosmic order they had established. The practical mathematics of power, one god's life traded for system survival. This narrative reveals uncomfortable truths about how the Sumerians understood power and social organization. The gods they worshipped were not portrayed as perfectly benevolent, not as beings of pure love and justice, but as administrators managing complex systems through pragmatic decisions that balanced competing interests. The Igigi's suffering was real and acknowledged. Enlil's fury was understandable given the threat rebellion posed. Enki's solution was clever but morally ambiguous, creating beings specifically for servitude rather than addressing why divine workers found the labor unbearable. Imagine the assembly as the text describes it: great gods seated in council chamber, probably envisioned as resembling the temple assembly halls where human city leaders gathered to make decisions affecting entire populations. Oil lamps flickering, casting moving shadows on walls. Anu presiding with the authority of heaven itself. Enlil still angry, wanting violent resolution. Enki proposing alternatives, always the problem solver, the god who found clever solutions where others saw only conflict. And the Igigi outside, waiting to learn whether their rebellion would bring relief or destruction. The vote was taken, We-Ila's fate was sealed, and humanity's existence, according to this myth, became inevitable not through divine love or creative whim, but through administrative necessity, a labor problem requiring engineered solution. The text does not celebrate this decision. It presents it as tragedy, as compromise that satisfied no one completely but prevented worse outcomes. The Igigi gained relief from physical labor but witnessed one of their own sacrificed to achieve it. We-Ila died not for any crime but because the system needed his essence. And the humans who would be created from his blood and clay entered existence already marked by violence, born from divine death, shaped for servitude before they drew first breath. This was the Anunnaki's golden age reaching its crisis point, the moment when their operations on Earth became unsustainable through divine labor alone, when something fundamental had to change. The decision they made in that assembly, to create humanity as substitute workforce, would transform everything that followed. The relationship between divine and mortal, the purpose of human existence, the question of what obligations gods owed to beings they had manufactured for their own convenience. The stars that had watched the Igigi labor for 40 years continued their measured wheel, indifferent to divine politics and solutions. and somewhere in temple workshops, preparations began for the ritual that would bring humanity into being. The creation of humanity, as the Atrahasis epic describes it, was not magical act requiring only divine word, but technical procedure following specific steps, using particular materials, conducted by the goddess Nintu under Enki's instruction. The text preserves details that suggest the Sumerians understood creation as process requiring expertise and precision rather than simple divine command. We'ila was brought before the assembly. The text does not describe his final moments in detail, perhaps because such specifics were considered too sacred for recording, or because the scribes assumed their audience knew the ritual procedures well enough that elaboration was unnecessary. He was slaughtered, the Akkadian verb suggesting ritual sacrifice rather than simple execution, his death conducted according to protocols that made it acceptable to the divine assembly. The mother goddess Nintu, also called Ninma or Belet Ili depending on region and period, took charge of the technical work. She collected Weila's blood in a basin, mixed it with clay according to proportions the text does not specify, and recited incantations over the mixture. These spells presumably activated the divine component, granted the clay rationality it would not otherwise possess, transformed inert matter into substance capable of becoming living beings. The process required precision. Too much divine blood, and the creatures might possess too much god nature, might resist servitude or develop capabilities that threatened divine supremacy. Too little, and they would lack intelligence necessary for complex tasks, would be no more useful than domestic animals already available. The ratio had to balance rationality with subordination, capability with control. Nintu worked the clay with her hands, the text says, kneading the mixture as a potter works, ensuring uniform distribution of divine essence throughout the material. Then she pinched off portions, shaping them into forms that would become the first humans. The text specifies 7 males and 7 females, 14 beings who would serve as templates for all humans that followed. The creation happened not in abstract cosmic space, but in specific location, the temple. Probably Enki's Iabzu at Eridu, the place where connection between earthly and divine realms was strongest. This situates human origins not in distant paradise or formless void, but in architectural space that Mesopotamians could visit, where priests maintained daily rituals, where the divine presence was understood as immediately accessible. In July 1965, British Museum curator W.G. Lambert was working in the tablet storage rooms, examining fragments from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh that had been catalogued decades earlier but never fully studied. Among pieces listed simply as mythological content, fragmentary, he noticed broken edges that suggested they might fit together. Lambert worked carefully, comparing the breaks, checking that clay color and tablet thickness matched, verifying that line breaks aligned properly. He found 3 pieces that, when positioned correctly, revealed a previously unknown section of the Atrahasis epic describing the actual creation moment in more detail than any other surviving source. The reunited tablet showed Nintu completing the first human forms, then breathing into them to activate life. The text described the clay figures beginning to move, drawing first breath, opening eyes to see the temple chamber where they had been shaped, and it recorded what happened next. Enki teaching them their purpose, explaining the work they would perform, demonstrating the tools they would use. This was not humans discovering agriculture and civilization independently, but receiving direct instruction from the god who had engineered them for specific function. The text makes clear that humans carry both divine and earthly natures. From Weila's blood comes rationality, the capacity for understanding and following complex instructions, for learning and adapting and solving problems. From clay comes mortality, the inevitability of returning to earth, the fundamental limitation that separates humans from gods, no matter how much divine essence they possess. This dual nature explained, for the Mesopotamians, why humans could build civilizations, yet remained fundamentally limited, capable of impressive achievements, yet unable to escape death. We partake of both realms, but belong fully to neither, created to bridge divine and earthly spheres while remaining subordinate to the gods whose purposes we serve. Imagine those first humans opening their eyes in Enki's temple, the gods standing before them, explaining what they were and why they existed. The chamber would smell of incense and lamp oil, of the river nearby, of worked clay still damp from shaping. Light filtering through high windows would catch dust in golden shafts, and these new beings, consciousness dawning in minds shaped by divine hands, would begin learning the labor they were created to perform. The Igigi watched this, presumably with relief that their burden was lifting, but perhaps also with discomfort at witnessing beings manufactured specifically for servitude. They had rebelled against unbearable work and won concessions, but the solution created new category of worker who had not consented to their role because they had been shaped for it before achieving consciousness capable of consent. The text does not dwell on these ethical dimensions. It presents the creation as solution that worked, as addressing the immediate crisis that had threatened divine operations on Earth. But reading it now, across 4 millennia, we encounter questions the original audience may not have considered. What obligations do creators owe to beings they manufacture for specific purposes? Can creating someone for servitude ever be justified? What does it mean that humanity's origin story, in this tradition, begins not with love, but with labor shortage? The Sumerians did not separate theology from practical reality the way modern religions often do. Their myths explained actual social structures, justified existing hierarchies, provided frameworks for understanding why civilization operated as it did. If humans were created to serve gods, then of course human society organized around temple service, around priests mediating divine will, around kings ruling as God's earthly representatives. The creation myth legitimated the entire system, but it also acknowledged the system's darkness. Humans exist because gods needed workers, not because we were loved into being or valued for our own sake. Our purpose is labor. Our destiny is service. Our consciousness is byproduct of divine necessity. This is not comforting theology, but unflinching acknowledgement of how power operates, how those who control creation shape what gets created according to their needs. The 14 first humans, 7 males and 7 females, were instructed in their tasks and sent to begin working. The Atrahasis epic describes them multiplying, spreading across the land, assuming the labor the Igigi had abandoned. The divine workers were freed to attend to other responsibilities, governance and oversight rather than physical maintenance. The system functioned again, crisis resolved through engineering solution that created entire new category of being. Yet seeds of future conflict were already present. Humans were intelligent, capable of thought and planning. We could learn, adapt, discover new techniques, and we would multiply, the text says, growing numerous beyond original intentions. Eventually, the noise of human civilization would disturb Enlil's rest, just as the Igigi's labor complaints had disturbed divine order. And when that happened, the gods would face new crisis, new question of what to do with creations that succeeded too well. But that confrontation lay in the future. For now, in this moment of creation, humanity entered existence as the Anunnaki's solution to their labor shortage, shaped from clay and divine blood, created to perform work that gods themselves could not sustain. Once humanity assumed the labor burden, the Anunnaki were free to organize themselves according to the hierarchical structure that texts describe in detail. This was not divine democracy, but clear ranking system, each god assigned to specific domain and function, authority flowing from supreme deities downward through levels of increasingly subordinate beings until reaching humans at the bottom of the cosmic organization chart. Anu remained in heaven, the distant patriarch whose authority grounded divine order, but who rarely intervened directly in earthly affairs. His name was written with the star symbol that also served as generic sign for divinity, suggesting he represented the concept of divine nature itself rather than functioning as active administrator. Decisions were made in his name, authority claimed through connection to him, but the actual governance of Earth fell to his sons and their subordinates. Enlil governed the space between heaven and earth, the atmosphere where weather formed and storms gathered. His title, Lord of the Command, indicated his role as executive authority, the god whose decrees became binding law for both divine and mortal realms. He wielded the Tablet of Destinies, though what exactly this artifact was remains unclear. Some texts describe it as physical object that could be stolen, suggesting it was actual tablet inscribed with cosmic laws. Others treat it as metaphor for the authority to decree fate itself. Enlil's temple at Nippur, the Akur or mountain house, served as the administrative capital where divine assemblies convened. The archaeological site shows continuous occupation from approximately 5000 BCE through 800 CE. The temple rebuilt and expanded repeatedly while maintaining its central position in Mesopotamian religious geography. Even when political power shifted to Babylon or or Assyria, Nippur remained symbolically supreme, the place where divine authority was considered most concentrated. Enki controlled the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean that fed springs and rivers. His domain was wisdom, craftsmanship, magic, the esoteric knowledge that allowed manipulation of natural forces. Where Enlil enforced law through authority and power, Enki achieved results through cleverness and technical expertise. His temple at Eridu contained the Mi, those divine powers or cosmic principles that governed how civilization functioned. Everything from kingship to beer brewing having its corresponding Mi that defined proper practice. The division between these brothers created productive tension. Enlil valued order, stability, clear hierarchies where everyone knew their place. Enki valued creativity, problem-solving, preservation of what Enlil might destroy in service to abstract principles. Their conflicts, which we have explored in earlier narratives, shaped Mesopotamian mythology as fundamentally as Zeus and Poseidon's rivalry shaped Greek traditions. Below these great gods, the Anunnaki were assigned to specific cities and functions. Nana, the moon god, received as his cult center, his temple Kishnugal becoming that city's economic and religious heart. Utu, the sun god, governed justice and truth, his daily journey across the sky witnessing all human actions and making him ideal arbiter of disputes. Inanna ruled Uruk, her temple, the Iana, serving as center of weaving production. Prostitution considered sacred to her, and military organization that made Uruk the dominant force in early Sumerian politics. Each city had its patron deity who owned the surrounding land, whose temple administered agricultural estates worked by human servants. This was not metaphorical ownership, but legal reality enforced through the same mechanisms that regulated human property. Temple archives tracked harvests from divine fields, recorded tribute from subordinate settlements, documented workers assigned to temple service, managed loans made from temple treasuries. The gods were understood as actual landowners whose estates required management, just like any wealthy human household. Imagine walking through around 2100 BCE, the city at its height under the Third Dynasty. You approach the temple precinct, where Nana's ziggurat rises 21 meters above the plain, its baked brick facades still bearing the bitumen mortar that waterproofed the structure. Guards check that you are ritually clean before allowing entry to the sacred courtyard. The air smells of incense and roasting meat from sacrifices, of beer stored in massive jars, of the date palm oil used in lamps that burn continuously before the god's statue. Priests move through the complex conducting daily rituals that maintain Nana's presence. They wash the statue each morning as one washes a living person, dress it in fresh garments, offer meals of bread and beer and meat. These are not symbolic gestures, but necessary services for a god who physically resides here, who requires care and attention, whose favor depends on proper treatment. The temple employs hundreds, priests and administrators, cooks and cleaners, guards and musicians, all serving the god whose protection makes Ur's prosperity possible. The economic scale of these operations was substantial. Temple archives from record estates encompassing thousands of hectares, herds numbering in the tens of thousands of sheep and cattle, workshops employing specialists in textiles, metalwork, pottery, carpentry. The redistribution system managed by temple administrators determined who received rations, who got access to seed grain for planting, who could borrow tools or livestock. This was centralized planned economy, operating at scale that rivaled anything achieved until modern times. The astronomical observations conducted from temple platforms served both scientific and theological purposes. Priests tracked the moon's phases to determine festival dates, recorded Venus cycles to predict good and bad omens, calculated equinoxes and solstices to coordinate agricultural activities with cosmic rhythms. The gods were associated with celestial bodies, Nana with the moon, Utu with the sun, Inanna with Venus. Watching these bodies move across the sky meant observing divine actions, reading intentions from patterns that required decades of accumulated data to fully understand. The Mold Apen tablets, astronomical compendium compiled around 1000 BCE, preserves centuries of observations, star positions marked at specific seasons, planetary periods calculated with precision, eclipse predictions based on mathematical models. This was empirical science conducted in service to theology, knowledge gathered to better understand and predict divine will as manifested in celestial mechanics. But the hierarchical system, for all its sophistication, carried inherent instability. The same texts that describe divine organization also describe divine conflict, gods competing for supremacy, subordinates rebelling against superiors, the orderly structure repeatedly fracturing under pressures it was meant to contain. Enlil and Enki remained at odds over how to govern humanity. Inanna refused limitations other gods accepted. Marduk would eventually claim supremacy over older deities when Babylon's political power demanded theological justification. And humans created to serve this divine hierarchy grew numerous and noisy. The very success of the solution to the Igigi's labor crisis created new problems. We multiplied, built cities, developed our own hierarchies that mirrored divine structure. Our activities disturbed the gods whose rest we were meant to maintain. The stage was set for the next crisis, the moment when divine patience with human success would run out and catastrophe would nearly erase civilization from Earth's surface. The stars continued their measured wheel, Nana's silver disk waxing and waning in 29-day cycles, Inanna's bright point appearing at dawn or dusk, depending on her position relative to the sun. And below, in temples and fields, in cities spreading across the irrigated plain, humans performed the labor we were created for. Unaware that our very success was building toward crisis, the gods would eventually feel compelled to resolve through drowning the world. The Atrahasis epic's middle section describes prosperity becoming problem, success transforming into crisis through the simple mechanism of human population growth. We had been created to perform labor, and we performed it well, too well. We multiplied across generations, our numbers increasing from the original 14 to hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands, spreading across the irrigated plain, building settlements that grew into towns that expanded into cities humming with activity day and night. The noise disturbed Enlil's sleep. This is how the text frames the crisis, not as resource shortage or environmental degradation, but as the god of air finding human clamor unbearable. The Akkadian word rigmu appears repeatedly, meaning noise, clamor, tumult, the sound of civilization operating at scale. Markets where merchants haggled over prices, workshops where craftsmen hammered metal and wove textiles, streets filled with pedestrians and loaded donkeys, children playing, adults arguing, the accumulated sound of 40,000 people living in close proximity, creating constant background roar. Enlil complained to the divine assembly. Humanity had grown too numerous, their activities too loud, their presence too intrusive. He proposed solution: reduce the population through natural disaster, send drought that would shrivel crops and bring famine. The assembly agreed, and the rains stopped. For 3 years, according to one version of the text, for 7 years, according to another, the skies remained clear while crops failed and granaries emptied and people began starving. But Enki, true to his nature as humanity's benefactor, subverted this plan. The text says he opened hidden springs, revealed underground water sources, taught people to dig wells that reached aquifers the drought could not touch. The famine was severe but not fatal to the species. Enough humans survived that when rains eventually returned, the population recovered and resumed its expansion. Enlil tried again, this time sending plague. Disease swept through crowded settlements where people lived in houses sharing walls, where sanitation systems could not handle the waste from thousands concentrated in small areas. The Mesopotamian cities, for all their architectural sophistication, had not yet developed the underground sewage systems that Roman engineers would later perfect. Waste accumulated in streets, attracted vermin, created conditions where infectious diseases spread rapidly. The plague worked better than the drought, killing perhaps half the population according to texts that preserve fragmentary accounts of this crisis. But again, Enki interfered. The myths describe him teaching healing arts, revealing herbal remedies, instructing people in sanitation practices that reduced disease transmission. Enough humans survived that population growth resumed once plague subsided. Enlil's frustration mounted. Each time he attempted to control human numbers through measured catastrophe, Enki found ways to preserve enough of the population that the fundamental problem, the noise that disturbed divine rest, quickly returned. A more permanent solution was needed, something Enki could not subvert, something that would nearly eliminate humanity and allow the survivors to remember the lesson. Do not grow too numerous. Do not become too noisy. Do not disturb the gods who permitted your existence. The divine assembly convened again, and Enlil proposed the ultimate solution: flood the world. Not a local inundation that careful preparation might survive, but total deluge that would drown civilization, destroy the cities, wash away the accumulated noise of human activity, and return Earth to the silence that had existed before the Anunnaki created their substitute workers. The assembly debated. Some gods were reluctant to destroy what they had created, concerned about losing the labor force that freed them from physical work. Others recognized that without population control, the situation would only worsen, humans multiplying until their activities overwhelmed the capacity of divine patience. Eventually, they voted to proceed with Enlil's plan, binding themselves by oath not to warn humanity about what was coming. This oath created the dilemma Enki faced in the flood narrative. He opposed Enlil's solution, considered it excessive and unjust, believed humans deserved preservation despite the disturbance they caused. But he had sworn before the divine assembly not to warn any human about the flood. Breaking that oath would make him rebel against cosmic order, would place him in direct conflict with Enlil and the assembly majority, would potentially trigger divine civil war more destructive than any human population problem. Enki's solution demonstrated his characteristic cleverness. He had sworn not to warn humans, but he had not sworn to remain completely silent. So he spoke not to Atrahasis directly, but to the reed wall of the man's house, describing in the wall's hearing what was about to occur and what needed to be done to survive. Atrahasis, listening from the other side of that wall, heard every word. The instructions were specific. Build a boat of precise dimensions, approximately 60 meters by 60 meters, 7 decks tall, coated with pitch inside and out to make it waterproof. Bring aboard family, livestock, craftsmen with their tools, seeds for replanting, everything necessary to restart civilization after the deluge. The specifications suggest real knowledge of shipbuilding applied to mythological scale, dimensions that would actually produce seaworthy vessel if someone attempted to construct it. The text describes Atrahasis building the boat while his neighbors mocked him. Why construct massive ship far from sea during drought when the real need was rain for crops? But the work continued. Cypress logs fitted and joined, decks layered one above another, pitch applied in multiple coats to seal every gap. When the boat was complete, Atrahasis loaded it according to Enki's instructions and waited. The flood came with violence that terrified even the gods who had decreed it. For 7 days and nights the storm raged, rain falling with such force that the text says, "The gods cowered like dogs, crouching against the outer wall." Even the deities who voted for this destruction were overwhelmed by its intensity, by catastrophe exceeding what they had intended or imagined. Inanna's lament appears in multiple versions of the text. "My people are like fish filling the sea." She regretted her vote to destroy humanity, mourned what was being lost, recognized too late that Enlil's solution was not measured correction, but near total elimination. But the flood continued regardless of divine second thoughts, water covering the land, drowning everything not aboard Atrahasis' boat. When the waters finally receded and the boat grounded on mountain, Atrahasis emerged and offered sacrifice. The gods, who had not received offerings during the flood, smelled the roasting meat and gathered like flies around the sacrifice. The text is deliberately unflattering, showing divine beings who had condemned humanity to death, now desperate for the worship and offerings only humans provided. They had nearly destroyed their own workforce, nearly eliminated the beings who maintained their temples and provided the sacrifices that apparently the gods needed, or at least strongly desired. Enlil arrived last, furious to discover that humans had survived, demanding to know who had broken the oath of silence. Enki's defense acknowledged his action while arguing its necessity. Humans were not destroyed for genuine crimes, but for existing too successfully, for multiplying as they were created to do, for being effective workers whose very effectiveness created problems the gods had not anticipated when engineering them. The assembly recognized the logic, even if Enlil remained angry. A compromise was reached. Atrahasis and his wife would be granted immortality, but removed from normal human society, sent to live at the mouth of the rivers where fresh and salt water meet. And humanity going forward would be subject to natural population controls, infertility affecting some women, infant mortality limiting population growth, aging and death ensuring that individuals did not accumulate experience and power indefinitely. The flood narrative, whatever its relationship to historical events, reveals deep tension in Mesopotamian theology. The gods needed humans but resented human success. They created workers to free themselves from labor, but found their creations disturbing in their very effectiveness. The solution to the Igigis' rebellion had created new problems requiring new solutions, each intervention generating unintended consequences that would eventually require further divine action. Standing beneath the stars that watched all of this, the same stars visible tonight, you can sense how the Sumerians understood existence as fundamentally precarious. Even divine order contained chaos. Even carefully engineered solutions produced new crises. The universe was not stable or predictable, but constantly shifting, requiring endless vigilance and adjustment, threatening always to collapse back into the primordial disorder that existed before organization imposed structure. The flood had passed. Humanity survived. But the relationship between gods and humans had changed. Trust broken, the understanding that we existed at divine sufferance made explicit through near extinction. We were workers who had grown too successful, beings created for servitude who had exceeded our assigned limits, and only Enki's intervention and the gods' own need for our services had preserved us from total destruction. The tablets that preserve this story rest now in museums, their wedge-shaped marks still legible after 4 millennia. And the questions they raise remain. Why create beings you might later need to destroy? What does it mean to exist only because your creators found you useful? How do we understand purpose when that purpose was assigned before we achieved consciousness capable of questioning it? The ancient Mesopotamians watched the night sky with attention that modern urban dwellers can barely conceive. Without electric light pollution, without atmospheric haze from industry, the stars appeared in their full glory. The Milky Way, a luminous river overhead, planets visible as bright wandering points moving against fixed constellations, celestial mechanics operating with mathematical precision that demanded explanation. These observations were not casual stargazing, but systematic scientific practice. The Mul-Apin tablets, compiled around 1000 BCE but preserving knowledge accumulated over centuries, catalog over 60 stars and constellations, document heliacal risings throughout the year, track planetary movements with precision that allowed eclipse predictions. The tablets describe how to use stellar observations for agricultural timing. when to plant barley based on which stars appeared on the eastern horizon at dawn, when to expect floods based on celestial configurations that repeated in predictable cycles. But beyond practical applications, the Mesopotamians saw theological significance in celestial mechanics. Each major deity corresponded to a heavenly body: Shamash the sun, Sin or Nana the moon, Inanna or Ishtar identified with Venus, Marduk with Jupiter, Ninurta with Saturn. These were not mere symbolic associations, but understood as the gods' physical manifestations, their presence visible in the night sky, even when they resided in temples on earth. When texts describe the Anunnaki descending from heaven, they may reference something more literal than modern readers assume. The Sumerian word for heaven, An, also meant sky, the visible firmament where celestial bodies moved. To descend from heaven could mean coming from the sky, traveling from celestial locations to Earth through space that astronomical observations showed was vast beyond human comprehension, yet somehow traversable by beings with appropriate capabilities. The planet Nibiru appears in texts in ways that continue generating debate. Some references treat it as another name for Jupiter, Marduk's celestial form, the planet whose 12-year orbital period made it useful for long-term timekeeping. But other passages describe Nibiru as crossing point, a location or object associated with transition between celestial and terrestrial realms. The word itself derives from roots suggesting crossing or ferrying, passage between separated domains. Zecharia Sitchin's controversial interpretation proposed that Nibiru was a planet with extremely elliptical orbit, swinging through the solar system every 3,600 years, bringing the Anunnaki close to Earth at regular intervals. Mainstream astronomy finds no evidence for such a planet, noting that gravitational effects of a massive body in elongated orbit would produce observable perturbations in other planets' movements. The solar system's dynamics are well understood, and no hidden planet of significant size exists in the configuration Sitchin proposed. Yet the textual references remain puzzling. Why describe celestial crossing point, if purely symbolic? Why associate the Anunnaki with specific astronomical phenomena if these gods were abstract theological constructs? The question is not whether Sitchin's specific interpretation is correct. Scholars overwhelmingly reject it, but whether the astronomical references in Sumerian texts preserve some understanding we have not yet decoded. Venus displays behavior that ancient observers found significant. The planet appears as morning star for several months, rising before dawn in the eastern sky, then disappears during inferior conjunction with the sun, reappears as evening star in the west after sunset, vanishing again during superior conjunction. This cycle repeats every 584 days, a period the Mesopotamians tracked obsessively across centuries. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, dating to approximately 1650 BCE, documents 21 years of Venus observations during the reign of King Amisaduqa of Babylon. The text records specific dates when Venus appeared on the eastern horizon before dawn, when it vanished, when it reappeared in the west after sunset, correlating these celestial events with earthly occurrences: good harvests, military victories, floods, plagues. The underlying assumption was clear. Venus movements influenced or predicted earthly events because Venus was Inanna, and Inanna's actions in the divine realm manifested simultaneously in heaven and on earth. Modern astronomy explains Venus's retrograde motion and disappearances through orbital mechanics, the planet's path around the sun creating illusions of backward movement and periodic invisibility when viewed from Earth's perspective. But perhaps the ancient astronomers were not entirely wrong to see pattern and meaning in celestial mechanics. The planets follow mathematically precise paths that span decades, cycles that dwarf human lifespans, yet remain predictable across centuries, suggesting order and regularity that transcends terrestrial chaos. Some researchers propose that the Anunnaki's celestial associations reflect actual astronomical knowledge encoded in mythological form. If beings came from elsewhere in the solar system, they would arrive according to orbital mechanics, appearing at predictable intervals determined by planetary positions. The myths might preserve memory of these arrival patterns, distorted through millennia of oral transmission, but retaining core astronomical data that careful analysis might recover. This interpretation requires accepting that the Mesopotamians possessed knowledge we can barely reconstruct, that they understood solar system geography in ways that conventional chronology suggests should have been impossible. The counterargument notes that human pattern recognition capabilities can find correlations in any sufficiently large dataset, that seeing astronomical alignments in ancient texts may reflect our desire to find hidden knowledge rather than knowledge actually present. The silence of the heavens offers no resolution. The planets continue their measured dance, Venus brightening and dimming according to geometric relationship with Earth and Sun, Jupiter marching through its 12-year circuit, the moon waxing and waning in cycles the Mesopotamians tracked with calendar precision. Whether these movements reveal divine presence or simply demonstrate physical law remains matter of interpretation, of which framework you bring to observation. Standing beneath dark sky far from modern light, you can begin to understand ancient relationship with celestial mechanics. The planets are immediately visible, not as tiny points requiring effort to locate, but as bright beacons impossible to miss. Venus at maximum brilliance casts shadows. Jupiter outshines everything except Venus, the moon, and the sun. Mars, during close approach, glows distinctly red, its color suggesting association with blood and warfare. Watching these planets move across weeks and months, you would naturally recognize patterns. Venus always appears near the sun, never in midnight sky. Mars brightens and dims according to roughly 2-year cycle. Jupiter spends about a year in each zodiacal constellation. These patterns demand explanation, invite theories about what drives them, what they might mean. The Mesopotamians explained them through divine action and interaction. Modern science explains them through gravitational physics and orbital geometry. Both explanations attempt to impose order on observation, to find meaning in pattern. Perhaps the ancient astronomers' error was not in seeking meaning, but in assuming that meaning must be personal, that celestial movements revealed divine intentions rather than impersonal physical laws. Or perhaps the distinction between physical law and divine intention was never as clear as we assume. If gods established the cosmos, why wouldn't their nature be expressed through the very laws by which creation operates? Why separate divine will from mathematical regularity when both describe patterns that persist across time with precision that allows prediction centuries in advance? The tablets recording astronomical observations still exist, their data accurate enough that modern astronomers use them to study historical celestial events, to refine understanding of how planetary orbits change over millennia through gravitational interactions. And the myths describing gods descending from heaven still resonate, still capture something compelling about the possibility that we are not alone, that beings might traverse the distances between worlds, that the silence of space might occasionally be broken by arrivals we can barely comprehend. The sky continues its measured dance, planets moving through ordained paths, apparently unconcerned with whether we understand them as divine actors or gravitational consequences. The mystery is not which interpretation is correct, but why humans need interpretation at all. Why we cannot rest content with observation, but must always ask what it means. What purposes drive the patterns we witness overhead in the patient darkness? Sumerian civilization appeared with startling sophistication in the archaeological record, writing and complex mathematics and monumental architecture emerging within a relatively compressed time frame that continues puzzling researchers. Around 3400 BCE, settlements existed with rudimentary structures and simple pottery. By 3000 BCE, cities sprawled across hundreds of hectares. Ziggurats rose toward heaven. Cuneiform tablets documented elaborate economic transactions, and trade networks extended across the known world. The question scholars debate is whether this represents rapid indigenous development or indicates knowledge transmitted from sources we have not yet identified. The conventional explanation emphasizes gradual accumulation across centuries, innovations building on previous innovations in ways that archaeological record partially preserves. Writing developed from token systems to pictographs to syllabic script over generations. Architecture evolved from simple reed structures to mud brick buildings to the massive platforms that supported temples. Mathematics grew from basic counting to sophisticated calculation capable of tracking complex commercial relationships. But certain elements resist explanation through gradual development. The base 60 mathematical system the Sumerians used appears fully formed in the earliest texts, with no evidence of simpler systems that preceded it. This sexagesimal notation, which we still use for measuring time and angles, allows for complex calculations, including division by many factors. Why 60 rather than 10 or 12? The choice seems arbitrary unless it reflects an inherited system whose origins lie beyond our ability to trace. The me, those divine powers or cosmic principles that myths describe Enki possessing, may reference something more concrete than abstract concepts. Texts describe them as physical objects that could be stolen, transported, transferred from one god to another. When Inanna takes the me from Enki's temple at Eridu and brings them to Uruk, she is described as loading them onto her boat of heaven, tangible items with weight and presence. What were the me? Some scholars interpret them as ritual objects, perhaps tablets inscribed with instructions for conducting ceremonies, templates for organizing social functions from kingship to brewing. Others suggest they were more abstract, representing knowledge itself, rather than physical artifacts carrying knowledge. The ambiguity in the texts prevents definitive interpretation, the me existing in liminal space between material object and metaphysical principle. Alternative researchers propose the me were technological devices or databases, information storage systems that preserved knowledge accumulated over long periods. This interpretation points to descriptions suggesting the me could be consulted, that they contained specific information about how various functions should be performed, that possessing them granted capabilities others lacked. If the Anunnaki came from elsewhere with advanced knowledge, they might have brought databases or instruction manuals, items that Bronze Age witnesses would describe as divine powers, because they conferred abilities that seemed magical. Archaeological evidence reveals technical sophistication that required extensive experimentation to achieve. Metallurgy demanded understanding how different ores behaved at specific temperatures, what fluxes facilitated smelting, how alloys altered material properties. The bronze produced by mixing copper and tin in roughly 90-10 ratio was harder than either pure metal, more useful for tools and weapons. But discovering that ratio required systematic testing, accumulated knowledge of metallurgical chemistry. Who conducted that research? The conventional answer credits generations of smiths working through trial and error, gradually refining techniques, sharing knowledge through apprenticeship systems. Each generation built on the previous one's discoveries, incrementally improving methods until sophisticated metallurgy became possible. This explanation requires no external knowledge transmission, only human curiosity and persistence applied across centuries. But the speed of development troubles some researchers. From the first copper smelting to complex bronze working spans only a few centuries in the archaeological record, perhaps too brief for purely trial and error development. Could knowledge have been transmitted from earlier sources, traditions predating Sumerian civilization that left no archaeological trace? Or does the compressed time frame reflect incomplete archaeological coverage, earlier development stages occurring at sites not yet excavated or in regions where preservation conditions destroyed evidence? The construction techniques used for ziggurats and temple platforms demonstrate engineering knowledge that seems advanced for the period. Foundation courses used different brick sizes to distribute weight. Drainage systems prevented water accumulation that would destabilize structures. Bitumen mortar waterproofed critical joints. These were not obvious innovations but required understanding structural mechanics, material properties, how buildings fail, and how to prevent failure. Acoustic properties in certain temple chambers suggest intentional design. At Nippur's main shrine, the room amplifies frequencies around 110 Hz while damping higher frequencies, creating an environment where chanted prayers seem to emanate from everywhere while normal conversation becomes muffled. Computer modeling shows this results from specific ratios of room dimensions, ceiling height, wall thickness, materials used. Changing any parameter significantly alters the acoustic profile. Did builders intentionally design these acoustic properties, or did they discover them accidentally and preserve successful designs through copying? Either explanation requires sophisticated understanding. Intentional design demands knowledge of how sound propagates and reflects. Accidental discovery, followed by preservation, requires recognizing that specific architectural choices produce desirable acoustic effects and maintaining those choices across generations of rebuilding. The underground channel systems beneath temples at Eridu and other sites exceed what simple water management required. Some tunnels are corbel vaulted, precisely angled to maintain flow without external energy. Others connect to chambers showing no evidence of practical use. Spaces too small for storage, too inaccessible for regular priestly activity. What purposes did these hidden systems serve? One interpretation suggests they represented the Abzu, physical manifestation of the cosmic underground ocean that Sumerian theology placed beneath Earth's surface. The channels allowed sacred water to flow through temple foundations, maintaining connection between earthly shrine and divine realm. This explanation treats the systems as primarily symbolic, engineering serving theological purpose. Alternative interpretations propose the channels had practical functions we no longer understand. Perhaps they were cooling systems, circulating groundwater to moderate temperature in structures that would otherwise become unbearably hot under Mesopotamian sun. Perhaps they were acoustic devices, the flowing water creating sounds that enhanced ritual atmosphere. Perhaps they served purposes that left no archaeological trace, operations that required infrastructure but produced no durable artifacts. The Baghdad Battery, discovered in 1936 near Baghdad and dating to approximately 250 BCE, demonstrates that ancient peoples possessed knowledge we did not expect them to have. The ceramic jar containing copper cylinder and iron rod generates roughly 1.1 volts when filled with acidic liquid like vinegar or wine. Some researchers argue this proves ancient understanding of electrochemistry, possibly used for electroplating gold onto silver objects. Mainstream archaeology remains skeptical, noting that no texts describe such technology, that the interpretation requires assuming knowledge appearing nowhere else in historical record. But the artifact exists, its construction suggesting someone understood that combining specific metals with acidic electrolyte produces electrical current. Whether they used this knowledge for purposes we would recognize as technological, whether they even understood it as electricity rather than some other phenomenon, remains uncertain. The silence surrounding these technological questions frustrates attempts at definitive answers. We possess the artifacts, the structures, the evidence of capabilities that required sophisticated knowledge. But we lack the explanatory texts, the instruction manuals, the detailed accounts of how and why these things were built. The gap between what we observe and what we can prove leaves space for competing theories, none entirely satisfying, all attempting to reconcile partial evidence into coherent narratives. Perhaps the Sumerians developed everything through indigenous innovation, human ingenuity applied across centuries of experimentation. Perhaps they inherited knowledge from earlier sources whose archaeological signatures we have not yet found. Perhaps the Anunnaki brought technical knowledge from elsewhere, information that Bronze Age peoples preserved in mythological form because they lacked vocabulary for describing it literally. The mystery endures not from lack of evidence, but from evidence that supports multiple interpretations. The ruins stand, the tablets remain legible, the artifacts survive in museum collections, but their meanings shift depending on which framework you bring to analysis, which assumptions you make about what was possible, what knowledge ancient peoples could have possessed, what the myths might preserve beyond symbolic theology. The stars that watched Sumerian cities rise still wheel overhead tonight, patient and silent, offering no answers to questions we press upon them. And the technology that built those cities, whether developed or transmitted, whether purely human achievement or aided by external knowledge, continues demonstrating capabilities we can observe and measure but not fully explain. The physical appearance of the Anunnaki, as depicted in Sumerian art, presents another dimension of mystery. Cylinder seals, those small stone cylinders carved with images and rolled across wet clay to create impressions, show divine figures with attributes that distinguish them from ordinary humans. They are taller in the carved scenes, their stature suggesting superiority. They wear distinctive headgear, horned crowns that mark divine status, different from the simple caps or bare heads of human servants shown in the same compositions. The horns on divine crowns appear in art from the earliest periods through the latest, a consistent iconographic marker maintained across 3 millennia. These were not naturalistic horns like those of cattle or sheep, but stylized, often multiple tiers arranged in specific patterns. 7 horned crowns indicated the highest rank. 4 horns marked lesser divinities, the number signifying position in cosmic hierarchy. What did these horns represent? The standard scholarly interpretation treats them as purely symbolic, visual shorthand indicating divine nature without reference to actual physical attributes. Gods were depicted with horns to mark them as gods, just as kings were shown larger than their subjects to indicate royal status. The art followed conventions that communicated meaning through size and symbolic elements rather than attempting naturalistic portraiture. But some alternative researchers note the consistency with which horned headgear appears in divine imagery, suggesting it might reference something more literal. If the Anunnaki were actual beings encountered by ancient peoples, their headgear might have included projections that Bronze Age artists rendered as horns, helmets with antennae for communication devices, breathing apparatus with protruding tubes, even elaborate hairstyles or cranial modifications could have been interpreted and depicted as horns by observers lacking vocabulary to describe what they witnessed. The Shining Ones, references that appear in some texts, describe Anunnaki as radiant, glowing, possessed of luminosity that set them apart from mortal beings. The Akkadian term Elu means bright, shining, pure, often applied to divine figures in ways suggesting visible radiance rather than metaphorical moral purity. When temples are described as places where gods dwell, they are often called shining or radiant, terms that might indicate artificial lighting, reflective surfaces, or something else that made these spaces visibly brighter than surrounding areas. Cylinder seal impressions occasionally show figures with what appear to be wings, though whether these represent actual appendages or symbolic representations of divine mobility remains debated. The wings could indicate the gods' ability to fly, to travel between heaven and earth through their own power. Or they could be artistic convention, a way of showing that these beings were not bound by earthly limitations, that they moved between realms in ways ordinary humans could not. The eye symbolism that appears frequently in divine contexts presents another puzzle. Gods are described as all-seeing, their gaze penetrating hidden places, their vision capable of perceiving what humans cannot detect. This might be theological claim about divine omniscience, the God's supernatural knowledge of events occurring beyond normal sensory range. But it might also reference actual technological capabilities, devices that allowed seeing over long distances or detecting things invisible to human eyes. Certain texts describe divine weapons that shine and thunder, that strike from distance without direct contact, that kill with invisible force. These descriptions could be poetic elaboration of conventional weapons like bronze swords and spears, or they might preserve distorted memories of technologies we would recognize, electrical weapons, projectile devices, tools whose operation seemed magical to witnesses unfamiliar with their principles. The question of physical appearance connects to the larger question of the Anunnaki's nature. If they were purely mythological constructs, their appearance in art would be entirely symbolic, visual representations of abstract concepts rather than attempts at realistic portraiture. If they were actual beings encountered by ancient peoples, the artistic depictions would represent attempts to capture observed physical characteristics using available artistic conventions and materials. The gap between these interpretations may be unbridgeable. We possess the art, the seals and statues and relief carvings that show how Sumerians depicted their gods. But we cannot definitively determine whether these images attempted to capture actual appearance or communicated theological concepts through symbolic visual language. Both purposes could coexist in the same artwork, realistic details combined with symbolic elements in ways that modern viewers struggle to untangle. Standing in museums where these artifacts rest, you can examine cylinder seals under magnification, seeing details the original carvers cut into stone harder than the bronze tools they worked with. The figures are precisely rendered, each element deliberately placed, the compositions showing artistic skill and attention to proportion. Were the carvers depicting beings they had seen or heard described? Were they following iconographic traditions that encoded symbolic meanings? Were they doing both simultaneously, capturing physical characteristics while embedding theological significance in the imagery? The silence of stone offers no answers. The seals survive, their impressions still clear after 4 millennia, the divine figures still distinguished from human ones through size, through horned crowns, through attributes that marked them as different. But whether that difference was purely theological status or reflected actual physical distinctions remains question that evidence cannot definitively settle. Perhaps this uncertainty is appropriate. The gods dwelled at the boundary between visible and invisible, between earth and heaven, between mortal comprehension and divine mystery. Their appearance in art might deliberately maintain that boundary, showing enough to recognize divine presence while keeping full revelation beyond human grasp. The horned crowns, the radiance, the wings, all these elements might serve to mark the gods as fundamentally other, beings who could be depicted but never fully known, described but never completely understood. The tablets that describe the Anunnaki's activities rarely detail their physical appearance, focusing instead on actions and relationships and the systems they established. When appearance is mentioned, it is usually briefly, in passing, suggesting the scribes assumed their audience already knew what gods looked like from observation or from artistic traditions so pervasive that elaboration was unnecessary. This assumption, if that's what it was, leaves us with fragments from which to reconstruct understanding. We know the Sumerians distinguished gods from humans in visual representation. We know they associated gods with specific symbols, attributes, celestial bodies. We know they built temples housing divine statues that were treated as physical bodies requiring daily care. But we do not know with certainty what the Sumerians believed they were depicting when they carved those seals, what they thought gods actually looked like when manifesting in physical form. The mystery persists in museum collections, in the carved stone and molded clay that preserve ancient attempts to make divine presence visible. And perhaps that is fitting. Gods, by definition, exceed mortal categories, exist at boundaries where conventional understanding breaks down. Whether the Anunnaki were beings with specific physical characteristics or concepts embodied in symbolic form, their appearance remains partially hidden, partially revealed, existing in that liminal space where myth and memory, theology and history, symbol and substance all intersect in ways we can observe but never fully resolve. The central question that drives both scholarly analysis and alternative research remains stubbornly unresolved. Why did the Anunnaki come to Earth? The texts provide answers, but those answers raise as many questions as they settle, opening interpretive possibilities that resist definitive closure even after a century of academic study and translation refinement. Mainstream scholarship approaches the myths as theological literature, sophisticated narratives that encoded Mesopotamian understanding of how civilization emerged and why it operated as it did. From this perspective, the Anunnaki's arrival represents metaphorical explanation for the transition from scattered agricultural villages to complex urban societies. The gods descended from heaven in the same sense that kingship descended, as organizing principles that transformed human social organization. Their need for gold and other resources symbolized the actual historical importance of trade networks, the acquisition of precious materials that enabled craft specialization, social stratification, the accumulation of wealth that made temple economies and palace bureaucracies possible. This interpretation emphasizes how myths functioned in ancient societies. They explained the world's current state, justified existing hierarchies, provided frameworks for understanding why cities possessed certain characteristics. If temples controlled vast agricultural estates, if priests administered resources and received tribute, if kings ruled as divine representatives, these arrangements made sense within cosmology that described gods establishing these patterns at civilization's foundations. The myths legitimated the system by claiming it reflected divine will, eternal order established by beings whose authority could not be questioned. But the texts themselves resist purely symbolic reading. They are specific in ways that metaphor rarely requires. The Atrahasis epic describes exact duration of divine labor, 40 years digging watercourses. It names the god sacrificed to provide humanity's divine essence, Ila. It specifies the number of first humans created, 7 males and 7 females. It details the dimensions of the boat that survived the flood, 60 meters by 60 meters, 7 decks tall. Why such precision if these were purely allegorical narratives whose truth resided in symbolic meaning rather than historical fact? Some researchers examining the same evidence propose that the myths preserve distorted memories of actual events, arrivals, and activities that occurred, but became mythologized through centuries of oral transmission before writing could fix them in permanent form. This interpretation points to cross-cultural patterns, flood narratives appearing in independent traditions across unconnected civilizations, creation myths describing beings from elsewhere who shaped humanity and taught civilizations arts. Perhaps these global patterns reflect not coincidence or cultural borrowing, but shared memory of events that actually occurred, experiences so significant they were preserved despite linguistic and cultural barriers that separated populations. The ancient astronaut hypothesis, popularized in the 1970s and maintaining substantial following despite scholarly rejection, argues that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors whose technological capabilities were mythologized by Bronze Age witnesses into divine powers. From this view, the need for gold reflects actual resource extraction, mining operations conducted to acquire materials for purposes we can only speculate about. Atmospheric protection, technological manufacturing, cultural significance in the visitor's home civilization. Zecharia Sitchin's specific proposals that the Anunnaki came from planet Nibiru in elongated 3,600-year orbit, that they genetically engineered humans by combining their DNA with that of existing hominids, that they departed Earth but might return when orbital mechanics bring their planet close again. These details are overwhelmingly rejected by mainstream scholarship. His translations of cuneiform contained demonstrable errors. His astronomical claims conflict with observed solar system dynamics. His biological proposals ignore what we understand about genetics and evolution. Yet the hypothesis persists not because of Sitchin's specific formulation, but because the underlying question remains compelling. The Sumerians were sophisticated peoples who developed mathematics, astronomy, architecture, legal systems, literary traditions. Would they maintain beliefs about divine visitors without experiential basis? Would they describe arrivals from elsewhere, labor operations, resource extraction, genetic engineering of humans, if these narratives had no connection to events or knowledge that felt real to them? The middle ground, rarely explored because it satisfies neither conventional scholars nor alternative researchers, suggests the myths functioned as real psychological and sociological forces, regardless of their literal truth. Gods existed in collective consciousness, shaping behavior, providing frameworks for understanding experience, creating shared reality that influenced how societies organized themselves and how individuals understood their purposes. From this perspective, asking whether the Anunnaki were real misses the point. They were real in their effects, in the temples built to house them, in the economic systems organized around their supposed needs, in the millions of lives shaped by belief in their presence and requirements. This interpretation allows for multiple levels of meaning coexisting. The myths were theological explanations, and they preserved cultural memories, and they described psychological realities, and they served political purposes. The categories we bring to analysis, the distinction between literal and metaphorical, between historical and symbolic, may be insufficient for understanding how ancient peoples experienced and expressed their relationship with forces they perceived as divine. Cross-cultural comparisons add complexity without providing resolution. The Hebrew Bible describes Nephilim, sons of God, who came to earth and interbred with human women, producing giants and heroes. Greek mythology features titans who preceded Olympian gods, beings who shaped creation before being overthrown. Hindu texts describe devas and asuras in cosmic conflicts that parallel Mesopotamian divine wars. Native American traditions speak of sky beings who descended and taught sacred knowledge. Aboriginal Australian songlines preserve memories extending back tens of thousands of years, describing creation beings who shaped landscape and established law. Are these independent developments, each culture processing similar questions about origins and authority through theological narrative, or do they preserve fragmentary memories of actual events, contact or catastrophe or knowledge transmission that occurred and was mythologized differently by various populations? We may never know with certainty. The evidence is fragmentary. The linguistic and cultural barriers between us and these ancient sources too substantial to allow definitive reconstruction of what they experienced or understood. What we can say is this: the question of why the Anunnaki came to Earth mattered enormously to the people who recorded these myths. The tablets that preserve the narratives were copied and recopied across centuries, taught to scribal students alongside mathematics and legal formulae, maintained in temple libraries as essential knowledge. This was not entertainment but explanation, not fiction but revealed truth about how the world operated and what purposes governed existence. Whether that truth was literal history, theological framework, psychological insight, or some combination of these categories, it shaped how Mesopotamian civilizations understood themselves for 3 millennia. And it continues shaping how we understand them, how we interpret the ruins they left, how we translate the tablets they pressed into clay, how we make sense of cosmologies that treated divine presence as immediate reality rather than distant abstraction. The stars that the Sumerians identified with their gods still wheel overhead, Venus still brightening and dimming in its 584-day cycle, Jupiter still marching through its 12-year path, and the question of why beings might travel between worlds, what they might seek, what purposes might drive such journeys, remains as open now as when the first scribe pressed wedge-shaped marks into clay and claimed to be recording truth about divine arrivals and earthly operations. Perhaps the question matters more than any answer we might construct. Perhaps the ongoing debate, the tension between competing interpretations, the inability to settle definitively on single explanation, all this uncertainty keeps us engaged with mysteries that transcend easy resolution. The Anunnaki came seeking something Earth possessed, and whether that something was gold or agricultural surplus or symbolic meaning or all of these simultaneously, their search continues in our attempts to understand what they were and why their story persists. The myths do not end with the Anunnaki establishing permanent residence on Earth. Multiple texts describe departures and returns, gods traveling between heaven and earth, divine presence waxing and waning according to patterns the texts hint at but never fully explain. This cyclical movement, if it occurred as the narratives suggest, raises questions about what drove these transitions and whether patterns might predict future returns. Inanna's descent to the underworld and subsequent return provides the most detailed description of divine journey and transformation. She leaves heaven, passes through 7 gates that strip away her divine powers layer by layer, dies in the underworld, is resurrected through Enki's intervention, and returns to the upper world changed by the experience. The myth operates on multiple levels simultaneously, as explanation for seasonal cycles of vegetation dying and reviving, as theological statement about limits, even gods cannot transgress without consequence, as narrative about transformation through descent and return. But the specificity of the journey suggests something beyond pure symbolism. Inanna wears specific garments and jewelry that are removed at each gate: crown, lapis lazuli beads, breastplate, all the accoutrements of divine authority. The gatekeeper demands she surrender these items sequentially, enforcing law that no one enters death's realm, retaining the powers of life. This reads less like abstract allegory than procedural description, rules governing passage between domains that were understood as physically real even if access required methods ordinary humans could not employ. The flood narrative describes all gods except those maintaining essential functions temporarily withdrawing from Earth. They ascend to heaven while the deluge destroys civilization, returning only after waters recede and Atrahasis offers sacrifice. The text emphasizes their absence during the flood itself, suggesting they physically departed, rather than simply withdrawing favor while remaining present. When they return and smell the sacrifice, they gather like flies. The unflattering comparison indicating desperation, need for worship that their departure had denied them. Why leave? If the gods dwelled in temples as physical presences, if they owned agricultural estates and received daily offerings, why abandon these during the catastrophe they themselves decreed? One interpretation suggests they feared the flood's violence, that even divine beings could be harmed by destruction of the magnitude Enlil proposed. Another possibility is that the flood was not local event confined to Mesopotamia, but global catastrophe requiring divine evacuation to survive. Later Babylonian texts describe periods when gods withdrew their favor, when divine presence seemed diminished or absent despite proper worship and sacrifice. These theological crises prompted extensive ritual activity, attempts to determine what offense had driven gods away, what restitution might persuade them to return. The texts treat divine absence as temporary condition requiring human action to reverse, not permanent abandonment but cyclical withdrawal that proper behavior could end. Some alternative researchers interpret these departure and return patterns as describing actual comings and goings, visits according to schedules determined by astronomical cycles or resource needs or other factors the myths preserve only partially. If the Anunnaki came from elsewhere in the solar system, orbital mechanics would determine when travel was energetically feasible, when alignment of planets allowed efficient journeys. A being coming from Mars might visit Earth during close approaches that occur roughly every 2 years. A being coming from more distant location might arrive at longer intervals.